Alrighty, Philosophy 81, and today we're going to talk about Confucianism and Taoism. We already talked about the history of China to a certain extent, so we'll jump right into the story of Confucianism. Confucianism is a religion that was founded by a man named Confucius. Now, originally, his name was Kung Fu Tzu, which means Master Kung, but the words were Romanized or Latinized, and so we pronounce it Confucius, and that's okay. He was born in 551 BCE during this age of 100 philosophers. He died in 479 BCE. Your book says something different as to his death, and I don't remember what it is, but 479 is the proper date for his death. So he grew up a poor boy. His father died when he was young. We don't know a lot about his childhood. We know that his mother was the sole provider then, and that she did what she could, took in laundry and so forth to try and provide for him. We don't know like his behavior so much as a child, except, and this I find very funny, one of the things that is consistently said about him is that he was an ugly baby. I mean, who says babies are ugly? But that's what we know about Confucius. He was an ugly baby. Maybe because of that, he decided to become something that was special and profound to make up for his ugliness. I don't really know. But he wanted to restore China to the golden years of the Shay and the Zhou dynasty. So remember the Shay dynasty being somewhat legendary, but it was the golden age. He wanted to restore China to that. So he said, if we want to live or have a life like they had, then we need to do what they did. So the first thing he said is we need to pay attention to rituals. All of the different rituals that we do that observe things and bring about activities like, oh, we're trying to do a ritual because we need rain, those kind of things. We need to look at what was going on in the Shay dynasty and the Zhou dynasty, and we need to do that. So we need to return to those rituals and follow them accurately. He also said we need to have rulers who are going to set examples. He was looking at developing a virtuous state. In other words, he wanted a society that was full of people who were good, people who were moral. And he says the ruler should be the ruler because he is the most virtuous, and he should set the example. And it's kind of a top-down kind of thing. If the right rulers are righteous, pardon me, if the rulers are righteous, then the subjects will be righteous, and so we'll have a society that functions well, is moral, is good, and we need to follow the moral values of the Shay and the Zhou. He created what we sometimes call virtue ethics. Actually, in the Greek tradition of philosophy with Aristotle, we have some ideas that are almost identical that come about 200 years after Confucius, and that's called virtue ethics. But Confucius created, in reality, virtue ethics. He says we need to develop a virtuous character. If we have a virtuous character, our actions would become virtuous. They would just follow, right? So we find out what the virtues are and we develop them and we make them a habit. We have to, practice them. And then if we do that, we will automatically do the right thing. So it's an important idea, and he says we can foster all of these virtues by knowledge and education. He's very supportive of education. He's also supportive of things like the fine arts and poetry, music, the classical writings, and of course the proper performance of rituals. He wants to develop a society that is full of gentlemen. He doesn't talk about women. In China, ancient China, women were just there to, take care of the babies, produce the babies, and feed and clothe the men. So he's talking about men becoming better people and becoming very refined gentlemen. His ideas tended to attract the elite and the ruling class, mostly because they had time to study. Whereas if you're working in the field all day long from sun up to sundown, you're not really going to have the opportunity to study all of the poetry and the fine arts. So it tended, like I said, to attract the elite and the ruling class of people. His ideas were not actually written down by him. He had followers and he taught them, and they wrote them down in a book called the Analects. So the book, the Analects, is not a book that you would start at the beginning and read to the end. It is a bunch of little examples. So it would say, so and so asked the master, and the master was Confucius, about education, and the master said, it is one who learns is better than one who already knows, and whatever the analogy might be. But there are these short little ones that fill in a story once you read them all and put it together. So it doesn't actually have a beginning and it doesn't have an end. It's this whole set of philosophies that are contained within it. And interestingly, the book could also be used as part of prophecy or divination. You could flip open the book, you ask a question, flip open the book randomly, point to a passage, and then read that and see how it fit to your question. That's not what the intent of the book was, but people did it. But he built a philosophy, this idea of being good and virtuous and following the ways of the Shay, out of three principles: Li, Ren, and Shu. Li, and it's a small I, L, pardon me, small L, I, small Li. Li is the perfect reflection of the cosmic order. So it's following the Tao. Again, both Taoism and Confucianism look to the Tao, the cosmic order, and we apply it to society. So you're not just trying to get yourself in sync with the Tao, you're trying to get all of society in sync with it. So you live in accordance with Li, which means doing what is right in the proper manner, at the proper time, and the right place. And that's happening because you are in sync with heaven, with the path. So sometimes we just go ahead and describe or define Li as propriety because it has to do with doing the rituals properly. Okay, having propriety, being regular and predictable, and the opposite of chaos, having proper conduct and manners. You want to be proper. So a sense of order and appropriateness brought into all aspects of your life. So Li is this reflection of the cosmic order. It's the reflection and the carrying out of all of this appropriateness, right? And you wouldn't just do it for show. This would be all aspects of your life. So if Li is propriety and you have internalized that so that you're doing it, then you develop the principle of Ren. Ren is the principle of humaneness. It has to do with things like altruism, right? Altruism means giving to others. So with altruism and humaneness, you're not focused on yourself. You're not selfish. You would try to develop a deep empathy and compassion for others, right? And Confucius says all people have this capacity, right? It comes from acting according to Li, and you have developed self-control, self-mastery. You're not being selfish. You are trying to make sure all of humanity is in good shape. Then the last of those three principles, Li, Ren, and Shu, is Shu. Shu means reciprocity. Reciprocity is you're reciprocal. Okay, so you do to or for the other what you would want done for you. You're using yourself as a measure. His actual quote is, "Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire." So you may have heard the golden rule, do unto others what you would want done to you. Well, this is kind of the others. Don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to you. I mean, between those two ideas, we have the whole field covered. But he's saying, look, if you don't want it done to you, then you don't do it to others. It's not something that people like. So with these three principles, a goal here is to develop yourself into, again, the true gentleman, the ideal person, what he calls, or what in Chinese is the Chunxi, and it's modeled after the ancient sages. Ancient sages would have been the people who were able to embody the perfect wisdom and the personal force or charisma of the virtue that comes from being on the path, on the Tao. Okay? So just to make that clear, once you have developed enough so that you are in sync and following the Tao, right? And you have wisdom and you have developed these principles of Li, Ren, and Shu, then you can become the ideal person, the true gentleman. And you're not born that way, it has to be cultivated. So that gets us back to the cultivation, which then says you must study all of these things. And he gives us this idea of the five ancient books or the five classics. The five classics sometimes get attributed to him. He did not write them. No, he did some editing on them, but he did not write them. But he proposes that you need to study them. So the five classics we have the Book of Rites. So that is the book that contains all of the rituals and rites that we need to learn and follow. The Book of Poetry are songs, right? Again, that helps us become refined. The Book of History. Okay. Book of History is literally the history of the civilization. So we need to know what has happened so that we can duplicate the good things that people have done in the past. The Book of Spring and Autumn Annals, and that is um, basically talking about the seasons and what's going to develop in terms of, maybe it's in the cosmos with the stars, or maybe it's when to plant and harvest, all of those kind of things. So it's not the full history; it's more specialized about those particular seasons. And then the last one is called the I Ching, or the Book of Changes. The I Ching is something that you may have seen in practice. It's a type of fortune telling or prophecy or divination, prophecy. Um, they moved from burning the bones to see what that was about to throwing coins and other objects in groups of three. And what coins is very, very common. And so what you would do is you take your three coins and you throw them and you see if they come up, one heads and two tails, or two heads and one tail, or whatever it is. And depending on whether it is heads or tails or all heads, whatever, you make a line. You wind up throwing them 6 times. And at the end of that 6 times, you get 6 lines. Some of them might be solid, some of them might be broken, have a space in the middle, depending on which coins that you throw or how they come up when you throw. There are 64 different variations. And there's a book, the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, that you then can look up which pattern came up. It's called a hexagram, the 6 lines. And you could look it up and you would say, oh, okay, here's the answer to my question. So it can tell you things that are um, going to happen, tell you, give you advice. And it's interesting because every time that I've done this, it has been pretty accurate. I actually have I Ching things and prophecy things at school in my office, but at the moment we're not allowed to go on campus because of the uh, pandemic, so I can't demonstrate it for you. I'm sorry to say, but in the past we used to take some time in class and we would throw the I Ching and use a couple of other divination devices that I have, and then we would see if they were coming true, and it was surprising how often they did. But those 5 books, those 5 classics, are books that Confucius says these are the minimum that you must study. You must know these. You must understand these. And this is the only way that you can become a chunzi, or the perfect true gentleman, by following what's in these books. Now, he gives us one more guide, and it's about the relationships. He gives us the 5 relationships. His view is this: in every encounter between people, there will always be someone who has a higher rank or higher position than someone else. And if we know that and recognize it and honor it, then we will have peace and harmony between people. No one will be getting their feelings hurt because they're not getting the respect that they think they deserve. People will know how to act. And so he gives us these 5 relationships, and who is superior and who is inferior. And so even though it is unequal, it is mutually beneficial. So he says, first we have the ruler and the subject. Obviously, the rulers are always to be more respected and treated better than the subjects. Next, we have the husband and the wife. Now, the husband is considered superior to the wife, and so he takes the role of the ruler in the household, and then she takes the role of subject in the household. So then we have the elder brother over the younger brother. Um, this is a practice that has gone on and still goes on. You have older brother who, after the father dies, then takes over the full estate of the family, and it's up to the older brother to distribute property or keep it all himself. Um, it's where the phrase number one son came from. Your first son, your eldest son, is the one who is above all the other children. Now, in these 5 relationships, Confucius doesn't talk about female children because they just don't matter, but he talks about brothers. So elder brother ranks over younger brother. Then you have elder friend over the younger or the junior friend. And not last, or last but not least, you have the father ranks over the son. So depending on who you run into, what group of people you're with, you're going to fall into one of those relationships. Let's say you're with a few of your friends, you're the oldest one, so you get the most respect. You get the last piece of pizza if you want it. They all defer to you. But then if another friend comes in who is older, that all shifts, and that person now becomes the one who gets the most respect. His goal in setting up very stringent, very rigid rules is to set up a view that says, look, if we follow these rituals, if we follow these behaviors, if we understand our position in the relationships, if we try to become cultured, if everyone does that, then society will be good. Society will run smoothly. We'll all be on the flow of heaven, and we'll be back in the glory days of China. We will bring that again. Unfortunately, during Confucius's lifetime, this was never put into practice by any kind of official or governmental means. He died thinking he was a failure. He had these ideas. He had followers, and they're good ideas. But again, he died believing he was a failure because he had not put it into, or gotten it put into government. Um, Approximately 100 years after Confucius died, we have a man named Mencius, or Mengzi, who was born in 372, and he venerated Confucius. He essentially viewed Confucius as almost a deity because he thought Confucius was so brilliant. And he extended and clarified Confucius's writings. He kept pushing for the state, because here it is, 100 years later, and the state hasn't adopted Confucian principles, but he is pushing. He keeps pushing. Um, he supported the mandate of heaven. He says that the goodness of the sages that uh, Confucius wants us to develop is there in all of us. So that's a little different, because Confucius says it's not there to begin with. You have to learn it from scratch. And Mencius says he thinks it's there in any of us, all of us, that we have natural good and qualities, but we need to we need to nurture them and follow Li and Ren and Shu and develop them fully. So, not a real conflict with what Confucius has to say. He also supports the idea of the five virtues that Confucius was talking about. And a lot of what he did was spreading the word, or at least keeping it alive. So, Confucianism had spread. There were followers. There were a lot of people who thought it was a good idea, but it never made it into the government. It never really did. It stayed classified as a religion, although some of the principles do show up in everyday life. Things like the five relationships. You show your respect for other people. So Mencius's main job was making sure that the word continued to spread and that people understood it. Um, Essentially, that is the wrap up of Confucianism. In China today, there are still Confucian temples, even though when Mao Zedong took over China and communism banned all religion, they allowed some of the Confucian temples to exist and some of the shrines to exist as a tribute to the great thinking of their people, and the not so much as a religion, but as a philosophy that was good. The the biggest problem that the communists had with Confucianism is that Confucianism sets up a real stratified hierarchy within the society, whereas communism says we're all equal. So this five relationships in terms of, you get more respect than me, that should not be happening. Nevertheless, they have allowed the historical elements of Confucianism to continue. I think we can move on to Taoism now. In Taoism, in a lot of ways, we have the exact opposite of Confucianism. I think I mentioned that before. We have a view here that says, yes, we absolutely want to be in sync with heaven. We want to follow the cosmic force. However, rules and regulations are not the way to get there. So they look at the Confucian ideology and they say, no, no, that's absolutely wrong. What we want is to be spontaneous. We want spontaneity and naturalness. So Taoism is based on a book called the Tao Te Ching, which means the book of the way and its power. So we're talking about the Tao being the path, and Ching is the word for book, and then Day is the power of the way. So it's trying to tell us how to be spontaneous. And that's a pretty interesting thing to say, because one of the first things it says is you can't teach Taoism. Like, I'm done, right? That would be nice. You can't teach Taoism because it's something that you just have to intuit on your own. It's something that comes to you. So the book, the Tao Te Ching, gives us some insights, but it doesn't tell us here's what you do, here's how you do it. It's also very disjointed, just like Confucius's Analects, in that it doesn't tell a story that starts at the beginning and end at the end. It's all these little snippets of things that happen. So when you do read it, you can put together in your mind some ideas of what they're trying to say. One is that harmony is found through the relationship of yourself with nature, not you and society, like in Confucianism. That harmony is disrupted by actions and social constructs. So if society says we wake up at a certain time and go to sleep at a certain time and all of these kind of things, the Taoists would say, nope, that's wrong. Society may say that. Maybe that was useful for people who need to work in the fields during the day, but there's nothing necessarily right about being asleep at night and awake during the day. Be yourself, be natural, sleep when you're tired, wake up when you're rested. Um, they want you to focus on and follow the experience of the Tao in almost a mystical way. You would free yourself of society's conventions and constructs, and you become natural, and you do what is on the flow of heaven because you have intuited that flow of heaven. So they're anti-educational. They say that the ideal person is someone they describe as slow and blockish. It's like childlike, children, young children. Think about toddlers. They do what they want. They do what's natural. They're playing with their toys and they're happy, and then the next time you look over, they've fallen over and they're asleep because they got tired, right? And they scratch where they itch, and they want food when they're hungry, not because it's dinner time. It's they're hungry, right? And that's what we should be like, according to the Taoist. Very natural. The creation of Taoism, or the writings of Taoism, were credited to a man named Lao Tzu. He was allegedly born in 550 BCE, so like Confucius and Buddhist, born right in that middle of that 6th century BCE. But he's probably fictitious. So, it doesn't matter when he was born because he probably didn't exist as an individual. But it's okay to refer to him as the writer of the Tao Te Ching. So we can say, who wrote the Tao Te Ching? Lao Tzu. It was probably a compilation from several different writers and collected. But the story says, or the legend says, he was leaving the kingdom of China and crossing into India. And the gatekeeper there said, you can't leave. You have all this wisdom, and we need it. Would you write it down? So Lao Tzu, who was sitting on the back of an ox that he had been riding, said, sure. And he wrote it down. That's the story. It was most likely written in the 3rd or 4th century BCE. The oldest copy that we know of dates back to about 195 BCE. So it's 300 years after Lao Tzu. But either way, whatever the origin might be, it has 81 chapters that are very short. Again, there are these little stories that you have to infer from them what they're about. They are intentionally ironic and indirect. They're poetic and playful, and you could also use the Tao Te Ching as a book of divination, just like you could with the Analects from Confucius. You know, ask a question, pop open the book randomly, point to a passage, and see what it says. But as far as like teaching it is difficult because here's again what it says right off. One who knows the Tao does not speak. One who speaks does not know. So anyone trying to tell you, here is the Tao, here is the way of heaven, they don't know. If they know, they're not going to say anything. They're just going to be in the flow. So impossible to teach. Nevertheless, I'll proceed. So, two things we can look at. One is that the Tao is this force that I've been talking about. It's the ultimate principle. It existed before heaven. It existed before earth. It was, unnameable. It unnameable and indescribable, and it causes everything, but doesn't take action. It's the natural flow of all life. And you can know it and understand and get with this flow through direct experience, and that can transform you into accordance with the way. You don't learn it through ritual, right? You might meditate, you might take a nap. Whatever it is that seems natural can lead you to understanding and following of the Tao. The power of the Tao, or the power of the way, also known as Day, is the qualities that you have within you, or that you are receiving from nature, that helps us along the path. So the following the path gives us the virtue. We attain the Tao. We achieve the power. And by power, I'm not talking about strength and power and dominance, because that's not what this is about. It is about achieving the power of the natural flow of things. There's a story I like to tell about the Tao Te Ching, or about Taoism, that kind of sums things up. And the story is about a man who finds a horse. So he finds a wild horse and he takes it home and he puts it in his stable. And the neighbor comes over and says, "Wow, you got a new horse. That's great." And the man says, "It's neither good nor bad. It just is." And the neighbor's okay. So then the next day, the man who found the horse, his son is riding the horse, trying to break it so they could use it as a riding horse. And he gets bucked off, and he lands and he breaks his leg. And the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh my, your son broke his leg. That's terrible." And the man says, "It's neither good nor bad. It just is." So a few days later, the army comes marching through, and the army is looking for young men to conscript for the army. In other words, they're looking for men to volunteer for the army, and they're taking him away. Well, they can't take the son away because his leg is broken, so he doesn't have to go off and fight. He gets to stay home. And then again, the neighbor comes over and says, uh, "Wow, this is great. Your son is saved. He gets to stay home." And the man says, "It's neither good nor bad. It just is." And the story can go on forever, because the basic idea in Taoism is that when we look at the moment, things might seem bad or good. But really, we have to look at the whole plan, or not plan, but the whole layout of what has happened to determine. And good and bad are artificial judgments. So we want to reject judgments, basically, or Taoists do. It's good that he finds a horse, but oh, the son got his leg broken. And if we stop the story right there, we'd say, "Oh, this is terrible because he broke his leg, and it's a bad thing that you got that horse." But on the other hand, if we continue with the story, it'd be like, "Oh, but then he didn't have to go to war," and so on and so on. So we can't take a slice of something and say that's the whole story right there. So the basic ideas, the basic tenets in Taoism is It rejects conformity to customs, right? Habits and rituals, those kind of things. The social norms are human constructs which create problems because they're not natural, they're not spontaneous. We need to look at the individual over society, nature over society. Again, society is unnatural, so we really don't want to put much emphasis on that. The best government is no government. Leave things alone. Let everything play out as it should, because if you leave it alone, it will work out as it should. Things in the universe, living things and non-living things, all follow this cosmic path, and it's when people get in and interfere that we start having the chaos. Education corrupts the natural goodness of humans because we start learning values that might not be the right values to be on the cosmic flow. We need to make we need to stop making, I guess, distinctions between good and bad, and things like, oh, life and death are good or bad, and unnatural, and all of those things that we look at. All those distinctions are learned, and really they serve petty desires. In other words, if I say, oh, it's good that I'm doing this, or it's good that I'm doing that, am I really with the flow, or am I trying to enforce something that works for me? Pardon me. So the Confucian ideal and ideal of perfecting yourself, becoming the sage, making everything in rigid format, and all of that, following the rituals and everything, is absolutely the wrong thing to do in Buddhism. I'm sorry, in Taoism. The ideal person in Taoism is non-analytical. Um, they're kind of considered no mind. In other words, they're not analyzing what just happened, what is going to happen, those kind of things. They want you to just let it go, because if you do that, you will learn without learning. And this person who has become, or it is totally natural, is someone who would follow the practice of Wu Wei. Wu Wei means literally non-action, but in actuality, it means acting in accordance with the Tao. When they say non-action, they don't mean, just go sit in the corner and wait to die, right? No, they mean do the things that are required by the Tao. Do the actions of heaven. Do the actions of this path, right? And so if it leads you over here and wants you to sit in the corner for a while, and you do that, that's okay. Don't think, well, society thinks this is weird, I shouldn't do it. Nope, do it. But then after a while, the heaven or the Tao will lead you to do something else. So you can go ahead and do that. You just have to do it in accordance with the Tao. You wouldn't be doing selfish things or aggressive things, not willful things that are like, this is, I'm going to harm you because it's about me. You're going to be actually acting through heaven, so you wouldn't be doing selfish things. You are looking inward for your harmony, not trying to structure society to make things different. Again, you want to weed terms like good and bad out of your vocabulary if you're a Taoist, because it's a false distinction. And when you say something is better, you're implying that something else is worse. And that may be a superficial judgment that's made temporarily. It may be that the only true good is knowing the natural way of the Tao. It seems almost impossible to carry this out in the world that we live in. In fact, it seems almost impossible to carry it out within society. You could, I suppose, have a lot of people just roaming about in their natural randomness. But, how do you hold a job? It's not natural to set your alarm and get up at 6 a.m. to go to work. It's not natural to do so many of these things. So how do you survive or exist in society? How do you know when it's time to go to the temple? I find that uh, kind of funny. Um, so there is a Taoist temple in Los Angeles, and I used to have students do field trips, and one of them, they would break into groups, and one of them would assign themselves to go to the Taoist temple. Well, the thing is, every time that they would call, they either didn't get anyone on the phone, or they'd get someone on the phone and say, "We're a class, we'd like to come, visit your temple." And the Taoists would say, "Sure, come on. How about, Tuesday at 4?" And the students would say, "Sure." And the students would go out there at 4 on Tuesday, and there'd be no one there, because the naturalness, the spontaneity had moved whoever was supposed to be there into not being there. So I never had a group of students, and I've been teaching this course for 20 years, successfully make contact with anybody in person at the Taoist temple. But that's not bad. They learned something. It was good for them. They were in accordance with the Tao. So all of this non-judgment that's going on seems very, very difficult, very contrary to how we live our lives. It causes the sage, then, the ideal person in Taoism, to become impersonal. They become unconcerned with compassion. They're unconcerned with feelings of sorrow. They ultimately move beyond those feelings, because those feelings are artificial constructs. And so they find joy in everything. Right? All things are playing out as they are supposed to, in accordance with the Tao, and so I am happy. There's an earthquake. It was supposed to happen, right? There was a new baby born, and it's very healthy and has all of its toes and fingers. Wonderful. It was supposed to happen, but I'm not going to get all excited about it, right? Whatever the case may be, what we would call good or bad doesn't make it good or bad. It just is. Again, like the man with the horse. 100 or so years later, actually it's more like 200 years later, we get the birth of a man named Chuang Tzu, and he was born in 369 BCE, and he is a follower, or someone who appreciates Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, and he expands the teaching of the Tao, pardon me, in a way that is less poetic, less mystical. It's more philosophical. I mean, you can actually read it from start to finish and it makes sense. You're not going, what? What's this about? So the book written by Chuang Tzu is called Chuang Tzu. He named the book after himself. And again, it's more philosophy, less mystery, less mystical. And he says freedom and naturalness are what you should seek, right? Free yourself from the world, that you create your own suffering, that conventional values cause war and poverty and injustice. You can see the connection between all of our conventional values. Oh, we need more land. Well, let's go fight with those people. Oh, those people don't believe the religion that we believe. Oh, well, let's go fight them and make them believe it. All of these things that we look at and have in our society that we need to eliminate, basically, are caused because of our conventional values. And that, he says, even includes conventional values in terms of concepts of time, space, reality, causation, language. So when we talk about things, are we really saying anything? Are we beyond language, right? This philosophical Taoism, called the Tao Chia, or the Tao Chi, is trying to make it more simple. And it is. But when you say, look, this is taking it beyond the concepts of time, space, reality, causation, and language, that gets difficult to believe. So we, for example, think everything has a cause. And if something happens, our first question is, what caused that? If you're hearing that weird sound right now, it's my dog snoring. So don't think it's me. Okay. Anyways, so we need to move beyond things like looking at causation. We need to move beyond things like, well, we look at things that we consider through conventional values to be useless, but we need to recognize that there's usefulness in that as well. So meditative techniques are important. Chuang Tzu gives us the book, the Chuang Tzu, and it's giving us a more philosophical, less mystical um, type of Taoism that gives us things more straightforward and talks about meditation techniques or meditative techniques, and gives us, again, philosophical Taoism. Now we have two types of Taoism. The original form of Taoism that were talking about with Lao Tzu um, gets developed further in around 200 BCE. So it's even after Chuang Tzu, but it gets a resurgence. What happens is people look at Lao Tzu and Taoism and they elevate him to the status of a deity. They think of him as a god. And they look at mysticism and emphasize it. So we had the original Taoism, which used mysticism and looked to it. Then we had Chuang Tzu, who gave us a more philosophical, less mystical Taoism. But then we get this religious Taoism that comes along from a resurgence of the original mysticism emphasizing Taoism. They were seeking special healing. They were seeking special um, activities like immortality. Again, the Taoist priests that had been doing alchemy to prolong life that wound up killing Qin Shi Huangdi, but in the long run was trying to keep people alive. Um, the alchemy gets into two types of alchemy. There's inner alchemy and there's outer alchemy. So inner alchemy is about trying to adjust what's going on in terms of like your elements within you. It is your thoughts and your body and how they interact with each other. And if you get that mixture right, you're good, right? Then there's the outer alchemy, which is the various elixirs and powders and other substances that people try to ingest to prolong life. The reason they wanted to prolong life is because oftentimes the longer the person lived, the more that they would know about the Tao, the more they would be following the path. And of course, if you have people on the path of the Tao, you'd like to have them stick around for a long time because it'll help things in the world. So meditation was part of the inner alchemy, and so it was useful in both religious and philosophical Taoism. Um, the Tao, pardon me, the Tao Chi and the Tao Jiao, but we'll go ahead and just call them the philosophical and the religious forms of Taoism. There were purification rites in the religious form, and again, alchemy was one of the big differences. So philosophical Taoism did not practice it, and religious Taoism did. Both Confucianism and Taoism are being practiced today, primarily only in China, and and primarily kind of underground because, again, the communist regime has banned all religion. So you see practicing going on in China, but the ideas of Confucianism and Taoism have spread to other countries. Um, Confucianism not becoming a major religion in other countries. Taoism is one that has been adopted by some people. They find it interesting. It was big back in the 60s and early 70s during the hippie days, and so we see those two religions still around, still doing okay, but not one of the dominant religions worldwide. They kind of were contained in China. All right, I think that wraps up China, and we'll move on to Japan.